Week 12 fantasy football sleepers. We're talking deep sleepers here. And a lot of deep sleepers are going to be in play this week. You're talking about week 12. You have all these bye weeks. And the bye weeks are really crushing fantasy managers because week 12 is right before the fantasy football playoffs for a lot of you. So you have 6 teams on bye weeks in week 12 and then 6 teams on bye week in week 14. So most people have fantasy football playoffs starting in week 15. So this is like must-win category. Some formats have the playoffs starting in week 14. So this week, Atlanta's on a bye, Buffalo's on a bye, Cincinnati, Jacksonville, New Orleans, and the New York Jets. Tons of fantasy football contributors, and some of the better players around are on a bye week this week. So you're going to have to be using some sleepers and streamers in a lot of your lineups. And if you don't, some of these players can be like waiver wires of the future. So you get a couple people who haven't necessarily listened to the show before getting in there in the comments. I would never use these guys in my lineups. None of these guys are viable. Well, some people play in deep leagues. Some people are in very, very competitive leagues. Some people are in leagues with 20-man rosters, 22-man rosters. So we need to be able to adjust with our competition and adjust to what's available. And every single week in the NFL, you see players who are not highly rostered perform well and put up big fantasy numbers. We're not just throwing darts at the board. We're looking to find players with opportunities, whether it's a player injured ahead of them, whether a player who's getting increased opportunities on a weekly basis. We're trying to find that sleeper that can help us win this week, or a player we can stash that can help us for the rest of the season. That's another thing. This week, get your benches ready. You got the fantasy playoffs around the corner. Plus, you know there's going to be another bye week hell in week 14. So maybe get a little bit ahead. Let's start out with it. This is going to be a little shorter than usual because we have fewer players to discuss. But there's 3 quarterbacks. Drake Maye, we talk about him all the time. He remains available to you. Everybody says, Theo, you overhyped Drake Maye. So let's kind of be real with it. Drake Maye, his quarterback finishes are as follows. He's finished quarterback 10, quarterback 7, quarterback 18, quarterback 16, quarterback 14. Those are in his full games played. Of course, he was knocked out of that game against the Jets where he had the rushing score. He probably would have finished well in that game based on his rushing upside. So QB 10, QB 7, QB 18, QB 16, QB 14. So he's solidly a mid QB 2, but he has upside. He's had a 3 passing touchdown game. He's also had a game where he rushed for 90-plus yards. So this is a player that even in a difficult matchup against a team like Miami, he's got some upside there because what he can do as both a runner and as a passer. A little bit deeper, these are your kind of super flex options. Will Levis, available to you in 89% of leagues. And of course, we're discussing players that are available to you in 70% of leagues or more. So there'll be a couple of players that maybe are available in your league. Go ahead and check on those. You can check the rankings at Player Profiler. So some of you will say, well, Will Levis, that's not necessarily a guy I'd want to use, but he is on the radar for super flex managers, I think, every week moving forward. He's got a couple of really good matchups coming up in the fantasy football playoffs. And this is a player that has had his 2 highest scoring performances over the last 2 weeks. And some things went well for him last week in terms of fantasy scoring. We can't count on a 90-plus yard touchdown every single week. But Will Levis is definitely more viable to us right now than he was earlier in the season. The other streamer to talk about this week for Superflex managers is Tommy DeVito. And Tommy DeVito faces off against the Buccaneers. But really, when it comes to DeVito, I want to stash him because it seems like Brian Dable is banking his job on DeVito winning some games. And who does DeVito have on Thanksgiving Day? The Dallas Cowboys. And the Dallas Cowboys are reeling. Then the following week, DeVito has the Saints in New York, then the Ravens in New York, then Atlanta on the road, and then Indianapolis in New York. So all of these matchups are potentially winnable, and he could end up being a player that actually not necessarily helps you, but helps you get by in a super flex format. So for better or for worse, Tommy DeVito is your quarterback this week. And again, with multiple quarterback injuries, guys like Brock Purdy out this week, people are going to have to be adjusting. This is a time where there's actually quite a bit of quarterback change. It sounds like Aaron Rodgers could be on the way out of New York. There's all sorts of variables right here. The Brock Purdy injury was one we could have never foreseen. So having quarterback depth, especially in Superflex, makes a huge difference. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're talking about running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, sleepers, streamers, and stashes. We'll be right back.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, oh, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than. You 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson at 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Welcome back. I'm Theo Gremminger. We're talking about fantasy football week 12 sleepers, deep sleepers, future waiver wire pickups, players for you to stash, and players for you to stream. And let's start out at the wide receiver position. And one player who has a lot of variables right now, but if Malik Neighbors sits out, Darius Slayton would be one of my favorite streamers this week. Slayton, of course, performed very well early in the year when Neighbors missed time. There's no reason he wouldn't step right into the Malik Neighbors role. He also has familiarity with Tommy DeVito. DeVito and Darius Slayton had a couple of games last year where he was not necessarily a smash play, but put up fantasy viable numbers. So keep an eye on the Malik Neighbors injury. He didn't practice Friday. As of the time I'm recording this on Saturday, he has not been ruled out. But if he is ruled out, Darius Slayton would be one that could go right into your lineup. A couple other players to consider. DeMario Douglas, available to you in 70% of leagues. Douglas is your classic floor play wide receiver. He's going to get you 9, 10 PPR points most weeks moving forward. Usually that's something you want to avoid. But in week 12 and week 14, there's some viability to using a player like that. Xavier Legette. Legette's available to you in 73% of leagues. Tough matchup against Kansas City, but I want to have Legette rostered for the rest of the season if I have room. He is obviously a very athletic rookie. He's going to be on the field a ton. Adam Thielen would have made this list, but he's still banged up. So Thielen was activated off the IR, but could potentially miss another game against Kansas City. Who knows what's going on there? But Xavier Legette, that's the one from Carolina I want to roster. First-round pick. We'll look to get some momentum for the rest of the season. Player to stash would be Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Yes, MVS, a player to stash. We can't ignore what MVS has done the last 2 weeks. And people will say, Theo, the volume was not there. But with the bye week, there's a chance that the 4-target game could be 6 or 7. And MVS has 196 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns over the last 2 games. He's sort of in the Rashid Shaheed role. He's obviously older. He's not a dynamic younger player like Rashid Shaheed, but MVS is going to get a ton of air yards, downfield targets, and that's sort of what Derek Carr can do okay. So I would not discount MVS and ignore him. It's about what his role is right now, not what he's done necessarily in the past when he's been sort of an also-ran. So 196 yards and 3 touchdowns over his last 2 games. Now a bye week where the volume could actually increase. Alec Pierce, available in 80% of leagues. 7 catches for 155 yards and a touchdown over his last 2 games played. Caught a 39-yard pass to help the Colts win last week. Boom or bust option. Difficult matchup. But again, we're talking about 6 teams on bye. Alec Pierce has connected with Anthony Richardson multiple times this season. Player to stash, Ray McCloud. If you have a room on your roster, McCloud is just a fun stash. It's a hedge on Darnell Mooney actually maybe being too banged up to play in week 13. So they're downplaying the Mooney injury as not serious, but it's a hamstring. If there's a flare-up, Atlanta can hold him out week 13. You could get a spot start out of Ray McCloud. Obviously, he's a $0, $1 bid type guy. Nick Westbrook-Akine, available to you in 89% of leagues. This is not a player that we think is very, very good, but he is a player that's been very, very successful. 5 touchdowns in his last 6 games played. He's on the field the whole time. We talked about Will Levis sort of having 2 back-to-back solid weeks. Westbrook-Akine has been part of that. So last week he had the long touchdown catch. And again, 5 touchdowns in 6 games. Cannot ignore that. Here's a potential streamer for you if you're in trouble this week. One player who I like this week, Devauhn Vele. Devaughn Vele is also a stash if you don't want to use him, but available in 85% of leagues. He's a rookie, obviously an older rookie, one of the oldest rookie wide receivers ever. But Vele is like, Denver needs a secondary target for the rest of the season to complement Cortland Sutton. Obviously, Bo Nix playing well. Vele could be a player that trends well and actually gets a little bit of momentum heading into Denver's bye week. Last week, 4 catches for 66 yards. He gets another catch or 2 off of a performance like that. That's usable. So Vele, if you're in a jam, like Darius Slayton, he'd be one I would consider putting in my lineup if I'm in a deep format and I need a spot start. Jalen McMillan, available to you in 85% of leagues. He had 15 targets in week 7 and week 8, was supposed to be a massive kind of waiver wire impact guy. I thought he was going to do very well when Chris Godwin went down. Didn't happen, but he could gain momentum over the rest of the season. Mike Evans is back, but McMillan's also back as well. Running backs, a couple of viable ones. This week, Roschon Johnson. DeAndre Swift missed some time at practice this week, was limited. But Roschon last week in Thomas Brown's first game as offensive coordinator replaced Shane Waldron and gave Roschon 10 rushing attempts, which tied his season high. Johnson found the end zone on a run, and he also has the ability to contribute as a receiver if Swift were to miss time. So Roschon is like your emergency, throw him in the running back spot, hope he gets 12 touches this week kind of player. He's also a stash where he has the contingent upside if DeAndre Swift were to miss time at any point for the rest of the season. Trey Benson. Trey Benson's probably the guy that I'd imagine is the last time I can talk about Trey Benson, because I expect for his usage to be ramped up, and he's only available to you in 73% of leagues, so he should cross our threshold. He's been a back-end RB2 in consecutive weeks. Arizona could be ramping Benson up coming out of the bye week. Braelon Allen, available in 75% of leagues. We weren't able to talk about Braelon Allen for weeks because he was getting touches, but people have cut him. They've become frustrated, and now with the bye week, Braelon Allen's one that a lot of people are sending to the waiver wire because he's not doing anything. It's been Breece Hall. Breece Hall's dominated the workload, but if Hall were to miss, Allen would be a top 15 play in any week he missed. Gus Edwards, available to you, 76% of leagues. 16 rushing attempts over his last 2 games. He's the handcuff to J.K. Dobbins, but he'll also get some weekly work. Again, available to you in 76% of formats. Blake Corum, available to you in 86% of formats. Blake Corum's a fun player for you to roster. No impact unless Kyron Williams were to miss time. But if Kyron Williams were to miss time, Blake Corum would go into everyone's lineups. The Sean McVay RB1 is a very valuable player to have, no matter who's in it. So Blake Corum, roster him if you have the space, and he's widely available. Cam Akers, another sort of lottery ticket, but one that's getting weekly touches. And in bye week hell in week 12, week 14, you could throw Akers in there in a lot of leagues where you need running back help or a flex, because he has 26 touches over his last 2 games. And at the very least, he should be rostered as an upside handcuff behind Aaron Jones. Okay, so now we've got the Raiders. Both Raiders backs this week. It's going to be Amir Abdullah. So if you need a streamer this week, you got to kind of suck it up and use Abdullah. This is not an ideal one. They play a tough defense in Denver, but Abdullah can catch the ball. So this might be Amir Abdullah has 4 or 5 catches week. He had a touchdown catch last week. He's had multiple weeks with like 3 catches. I think Abdullah could push that up to 4 or 5 catches this week if he's on the field the whole time. Again, Alexander Mattison, Zamir White expected to miss. Abdullah would be the one I would bet on. He's available to you in 90% of leagues. And I think if you are in a awful spot for an RB2, or if you're looking for a flex, Abdullah should get enough targets out of the backfield that he could be viable. Dylan Lobby available to you in 99% of leagues. This is like the, hey, Theo, I don't want to add Amir Abdullah ever. I'd rather take the mystery box. Well, Dylan Lobby has 1 carry all season long, and he fumbled it. But he was an intriguing draft pick. And this could be like the game where he sees some extended work. Again, this is a speculative ad for deeper leagues, but Lobby is one to keep an eye on. If you have a roster spot, go ahead and grab him. Maybe Las Vegas uses him this week, and then he becomes a waiver wire addition next week. But my bet would be on boring veteran Amir Abdullah. But again, Lobby, if you think I'm wrong. Tight end, short list. Not a ton of players here on the tight ends. Isaiah Likely, available to you in 70% of leagues. He's back on our radars. He led Baltimore in receiving yards, and he tied for the team lead in catches last week. Isaiah Likely obviously was dynamic in that opening game against the Chiefs. A lot of people threw a ton of fab on him. You saw him being traded for very high trade packages in like dynasty formats. And then, of course, Mark Andrews has really come on. But last week, this could be a sign of some things to come. Likely missed some time, but he comes back and he's seeing a larger role. And this is a player that made a big impact down the stretch last season. So again, if you're in a jam this week at tight end, or if you want a speculative ad, Isaiah Likely is on the radar. Another player who's going to be in a lot of lineups this week, Luke Schoonmaker. And Luke Schoonmaker is available to you in 91% of leagues. He's literally in the same role as Jake Ferguson any week that Ferguson misses. And Ferguson's banged up now. So you might get 2 starts out of Schoonmaker. You might get this week and you might get Thanksgiving. And this is a very athletic player. This is a player who was highly drafted out of Michigan. Big time athlete. Like the testing numbers were strong. And Schoonmaker last week had 10 targets, 6 catches for 56 yards. So again, this Dallas Cowboys offense is really bad right now. But I think Schoonmaker is going to give you 5-6 catches this week. And that's kind of it's a low bar to cross to be a starting tight end, to be a top 12 tight end. I think Schoonmaker could be right there. Jatavian Sanders available to you in 95% of leagues. He's trending up. I'd like to add him, much like I talked about Legette. Sanders is one that I'd consider adding, even with the difficult matchup against Kansas City. Not to use him this week, but to have him stashed on my bench. We saw him have an 87 catch game. Then we saw him catch a touchdown. Then Carolina goes on bye. Now he's back. Does Carolina ramp up his usage? And Jatavian Sanders, again, as a tight end, are the bar is sort of low to cross to make an impact. But you've seen this in multiple seasons where a rookie tight end ends up kind of catching fire and ends up being like tight end 10 for the rest of the season. Don't put that outside the realm of possibilities with Sanders. His teammate competition for targets right now is Legette, Coker, Adam Thielen's still banged up. So an older veteran who's injured and 2 rookie wide receivers who haven't exactly been target magnets. So maybe Sanders ends the season well, gets a little momentum heading into 2025. Theo Johnson, same thing with Sanders. And I think Johnson also would get elevated if Malik Neighbors misses. This is a very athletic player, was targeted 6 times in back-to-back games, not a tight end 1. And I think his upside in terms of targets is probably about the same as Sanders, but a little bit more target competition, certainly with Malik Neighbors, with Wan'Dale Robinson, with Darius Slayton. So Sanders, I think I would add over Johnson this week, but it's super, super close. And you can flip those 2 around if Malik Neighbors misses time. So both those players are available to you. All 3 of those tight ends besides Likely are available to you in at least 90% of leagues. They're all sort of speculative plays. If I need a spot start, I'm probably going to go with Schoonmaker or likely over the rookies for sure. Again, this week, not that exciting, but this is a tough week. Next week will be fun because next week there's no teams on bye, but then week 14 coming around, week 14 is going to be an awful week for fantasy managers because it's another 6 teams on bye in a week that everybody needs a win. Baltimore, Denver, Houston, Indianapolis, New England, and the Washington Commanders all on buys in week 14. I'm Theo Gremminger. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it helps us a lot. And if I don't see you guys, well, I'll see you with the Waiver Wire show. But if you only show up for sleepers, have a great Thanksgiving. Make sure you join us right after. We're going to help you crush your leagues for the rest of the season. We're going to get you fully ready for the fantasy football playoffs. Stick with us here at Player Profiler.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.